Hey, it's your old pal Lucid Stew again. In this video, we're going to consider a recent industry live virtual panel event with the topic of what would it take to complete the California high-speed rail in 5 years? Unfortunately, the panel didn't do much to address the question in real-world terms, so let's do that now. The first thing we need to talk about is the difference between what is possible, what is practical, and what is likely. The panel started off with some comparisons of what is possible, the US landing a man on the moon, building the transcontinental railroad, and some recent accomplishments by the Chinese as it relates to high-speed rail. Is it possible to build the rest of California high-speed rail in 5 years? Yes, but much like the comparisons made by the panel, this happens in a world that ignores reality. These comparisons have major issues. It took 9 years at twice the expense of California high-speed rail to put 2 people on the moon, and that was a national priority motivated by threat of nuclear war. The first transcontinental railroad took 6 years to complete. The land was mostly taken by force, and labor practices were far below modern standards. It only got through Congress because of Civil War and resulted in the Credit Mobilier scandal, which is one of the worst examples of fraud and corruption in US history. It was also a national priority because the country needed means of securing its newly acquired Pacific Coast territory. If the Chinese rail industry were given free rein, they might be able to pull off most of the California high-speed rail route in 5 years. That cannot happen, however, due to the gamut of laws from environmental to labor to buy American. The reason China has the capability to build quickly is that they've been developing it for more than 30 years, and their laws are not as restrictive to the practice. High-speed rail is also a national priority in China because they have 4 times the US population in the same space. We've hit on a theme here: national priority. Let's discuss what kind of priority high-speed rail possesses in the United States on a national scale. All high-speed rail in the United States is in the Northeast Corridor, and it's generally accepted that amounts to about 40 miles worth. The Northeast Corridor main line is mostly owned by Amtrak, and this fact sets it apart from nearly every other rail line in the country. This is because the various US freight rail companies own 99.9% of the track mileage in the country, and they ultimately control what happens with it. From this, we can see that high-speed rail clearly is not a national priority. To build California high-speed rail in 5 years, this would need to change instantly, despite the even split in Congress that looks like it will continue until at least 2026. This means a massive funding windfall is extremely unlikely. Looking at practicality, improvement of intercity passenger rail in the United States generally falls into one of 3 categories. Number 1, upgrading the Northeast Corridor. Because Amtrak owns most of the NEC main line, this is the most practical of the 3 to improve from a logistical standpoint. However, that track is tightly coupled with Amtrak, and Amtrak doesn't produce enough operating profit to properly maintain it. Federal meddling lowers the practicality because federal politics around Amtrak becomes a factor in NEC funding. The NEC was not designed with high-speed rail in mind and runs through the most densely populated part of the country. It can be expensive to improve for high-speed rail, further deteriorating the practicality of this choice. However, it is likely to get funding because it is the most heavily used corridor. Number 2, upgrade freight rail rights-of-way. Most freight is economically moved at slow speed, and most freight rights-of-way are designed accordingly. In addition, a lot of development has occurred in the United States near freight rights-of-way. This often makes it expensive to straighten them out and support higher passenger speeds. Freight rights-of-way can be a very practical choice. However, try to electrify things and alter these rights-of-way to high speed and you run into trouble. Freight rail companies prefer their current highly profitable status quo, which provides for minimal cooperation. The likeliness of the choice depends on the particular route. Number 3, create new rail rights-of-way with passenger rail in mind. This seems like a simple solution, but it can be expensive and time-consuming to acquire the land required. One notable exception is the interstate highway system rights-of-way, which is why those make attractive alternatives for high-speed rail when applicable. New rail rights-of-way can be a very practical choice, but likeliness depends on the obstacles presented by acquiring rights to use the land. The condition all three have in common is that they're either expensive or not the best fit for high-speed rail, and sometimes both, hurting their practicality. Because of that, it's a tough political sell, and political support has been slow to gain momentum, making high-speed rail less likely in general. In addition, high-speed intercity lines work best when they're connected to other transit networks. This can also be expensive and/or hampered by freight rail. Better transit networks would create demand for high-speed rail, but high-speed rail would also create demand for better transit networks. This chicken or the egg situation hurts momentum for both. Also, the United States has world-leading road and commercial airport networks, which makes for an environment with less natural need to travel by rail. In order to work in the United States, high-speed rail needs to be even more competent than it is in Europe or Asia due to greater competition from other modes of travel and relative lack of local transit. As a result, high-speed rail in the United States faces strong headwinds. As it stands, Phase 1 of the California high-speed rail system is projected to cost $106 billion if completed in 2034. This brings up a couple more issues. Number 1, when we say build California high-speed rail, what part are we talking about? Issue number 2, what will the cost of that part be if we try to complete it in 5 years? There are 3 possible ways of interpreting complete. Let's examine them and their corresponding cost to build in 5 years. The first is the initial operating segment. This is a portion of the system that runs from Merced to Bakersfield. It represents about 170 miles of track and has been put forth as the portion California can afford to build as is. It is scheduled to be operational around 2030. We'll save $2 billion from inflation if we finish 2 years early for a cost of $31.8 billion. Currently identified funds through 2028 add up to $23.2 billion. In addition, California high-speed rail's portion of the state cap-and-trade auction receipts may be underestimated by about $1 billion, so let's call it $8 billion short. The answer to building Merced to Bakersfield in 5 years is simple: another $8 billion and a 30% faster schedule than currently planned. Both are attainable. The California High-Speed Rail Authority grew its capability at a greater rate between 2015 and 2019. Where would $8 billion come from, though? The Federal State Partnership for Intercity Passenger Rail Grant Program. There are also other smaller federal grant programs that apply. More state money is possible, but California High-Speed Rail already gets about $1 billion a year in state funds through cap and trade, in addition to the $300 million a year the state expends servicing the $9 billion California High-Speed Rail bond. Possible? Yes. Practical? Not really, because $8 billion from FSP National is a very large percentage of what's available. Likely? No, mainly because it doesn't look like the $8 billion from the federal government will show up that quickly. Next definition of complete would be Phase 1. This is about 500 miles of track from San Francisco to Anaheim through Los Angeles. Cost of Phase 1 is estimated at $106 billion if completed by 2034. $11 billion has been expended so far, leaving $95 billion to go. Knock off a few years of inflation at 3%, and we get about $80 billion if done by 2028. Where is $80 billion coming from in 5 years? Only one answer: the federal government. Let's put this into perspective. The FSP NEC grant budget for 2023 is about $9 billion. The NEC accounts for more than 40% of inner-city rail travel in the country. It's about the same length as California High-Speed Rail Phase 1, but it traverses 8 states and links 5 of the top 20 most populous metropolitan areas in the United States. California High-Speed Rail Phase 1, by comparison, would link 2 of the top 20, all in one state. Look at it from the perspective of a non-California legislator. If bringing funds home to your constituents is what gets you reelected, wouldn't you want some of that $80 billion going to your home state, rather than all of it going to California? We're talking about nearly 180% of the NEC's grants going to a single state here, with nothing extra for anyone else. It's not practical, nor is it likely. A massive windfall for every state in the next 5 years would be more likely, but less practical. If $80 billion for California was extended per capita to the rest of the country, it would come to $650 billion. The California High-Speed Rail Authority has a capability of expending about $2 billion a year. To complete California High-Speed Rail in 5 years, $80 billion has to be expended in that time. This would require an organizational capacity expansion of about $2.5 billion per year, which is more than they've managed since 2008. Possible? Yes. Practical? Not really. Likely? Nah. China didn't do this. They built up the capacity over decades, and that's why they'd be able to build 500 miles of high-speed rail in 5 years, and it's why the California High-Speed Rail Authority wouldn't. Now let's talk tunnels. You have 3 12 to 13 mile tunnels in the project, each of which is a 6-year project. That's 2 independent custom tunnel boring machines for each. You'll need a couple more to dig the dozen other smaller tunnels. Now you're looking at 8 huge custom TBMs. Time from procurement to deployment on those is about a year, so you'll probably need a 9th and a 10th just to cover all your bases. All that is assuming things go pretty well while boring for an organization that's never done it. Possible? Yep. Practical? Nope. Likely? Nope. Now for our final definition of complete, the entire 800-mile system, including extensions to San Diego and Sacramento. That would be about $135 billion. That is $27 billion a year, or about half of what is spent on the 220,000-mile national highway system. Possible? Yes. Practical? No. Likely? More importantly, none of the environmental or design work is done on Phase 2 to San Diego and Sacramento. Nothing beyond preliminary route analysis has been done. It would take years to get that through the environmental review process, even if corners were cut. This is a no-go without completely tearing down the existing environmental process. Let's call that not practical, not likely, and not possible. To summarize and conclude this presentation, what would it take to complete the California High-Speed Rail in 5 years? If we're talking Merced to Bakersfield, it would take $8 billion. If we're talking Phase 1, it would take an immediate shakeup of Congress into railfan territory, and the Army Corps of Engineers would probably need to take over the project. If we're talking the full 800-mile system, it would take an act of God, or the invention of perpetual motion, or a time machine, or an interdimensional wormhole that can summon demonic construction workers. I hope you enjoyed this response to the prompt, what would it take to complete the California High-Speed Rail in 5 years? Up next will be a video about the preferred alternative high-speed rail route between Atlanta and Charlotte, which has a Tier 1 record of decision. Also on the 29th will be the next edition of Stu's News, covering the high-speed rail news for the last month. But that's all for now. Until next time, I'll see you on that big beautiful freeway.